One question I didn't ask you guys when we were in the individual sessions was about Tesla itself, which always tends to be sort of an interesting topic. So I'm just curious briefly for each of you to kind of talk about what's your feeling about Tesla long term, its viability. You know, there's been a lot of controversy this year. What's your thought? Go ahead, Daron, why don't you start?
Okay. Can you hear me okay? So I started working with Tesla in 2009, and everybody said that they were never going to make it in 2009. And suddenly Daimler invested $50 million in May of 2009. And suddenly they were viable because they put a valuation on them for 10% it was $500 million. Daimler made a fortune off of their investment in Tesla. Every time that I give the Tesla team credit for it's very talented. They had lots of turnover, and Elon is kind of a brilliant mastermind behind it. So I think that Tesla, actually, I'm pretty optimistic that Tesla will continue on because he seems to have a way of pulling the rabbit out of the hat, even when things get down. Eventually, I don't know that Tesla is actually survives on its own if it doesn't get folded into something else in the longer term. But I think that I met with the team out there, and even though it's young and radical, and I think they're a very talented group. So I'm more pro than not.
Jeff?
I guess similar to the tweet comment I said about the Washington, I'd say the same thing here. It ebbs and flows by some of the actions that have happened this year. I think right now, I would totally agree. Give them a lot of credit for what they've built. I think it's a fantastic model. It has been very disruptive to the industry, and it's been good for the industry. I think there's a few things that I'm looking at that suggest there's some challenges ahead. And I wouldn't say we're not bearish on them necessarily, but I think from a competitive model, he really hasn't had competition. He's going to. His price point with the credits is going to be a challenge. I think we still have to see what kind of quality Model 3 has. I think that could be a challenge as well. I mean, historically, the quality hasn't been up to standards, with the rest of the major OEMs. So how forgiving is the Model 3 buyer going to be in that space? So I think there's a lot of challenges ahead. But to Daron's point, he's been able to get through those, even his own personal mouth challenges. I certainly wouldn't write Tesla off, but I also would agree that at some point they probably get folded in before it plays completely out.
Completely disagree with Jeff. Introduce the cage match aspect.
That's how it's going to be.
Right? No, not entirely true. So I would say we've gone down the road as YF and JCI before that with Fisker, with all kinds, Neo, SF Motors, V Vehicle. I don't know if you guys remember V Vehicle. Frank Verasano started a car company. We were in that. So lots of experience of things not working out. Strike that. I was a complete Tesla skeptic because I've gone through all of those other iterations. But every time I vote against Tesla, they beat me, and I'm tired of being wrong, honestly. So my personal opinion is that, and I would say this is probably the YF opinion, we are a supplier to Tesla. We ship, so this is where I challenged Jeff, conversation at lunch, I challenged Jeff Scraff on Tesla. We ship 6,000 parts a week for the Model 3 right now. If that keeps up, that's 300,000 Model 3s next year, let alone Model S's, Model Y's, Model X's, et cetera. I do think, and there's a lot of rumors going around Silicon Valley, that Tesla gets bought. Elon Musk doesn't want to make cars, he wants to change the world. He's already kind of made his claim. So what a great deal if Apple buys Tesla. Apple immediately gets the car manufacturing. They get now a platform to apply their user experience into. That's a pure rumor, by the way. I have no inside information for that. But to me, that makes a ton of sense. Someone who wants to get into that space, who needs an electric platform, Tesla's ready-made, and people who buy Teslas are rabidly excited about their Tesla. You may think it's a strange car, or it's kind of cute, or whatever. Those people will punch you in the face if you tell them that Tesla's not a good car. Actually, they'll just call you stupid. You're from Detroit, you don't understand. People who buy Teslas are in love with their Tesla.
Or you're old and you don't understand. That's what I hear from my employees. You're old, you don't understand.
Just a little disclaimer on the graph, that was US only. You're shipping to the rest of the world.
Fair point. Touche.
Jeff Stout, just one question, maybe an unfair question, but can you talk a little bit, since you seem to be pretty open about talking about unfair questions. I didn't really ask you about what it's like to be working for a Chinese company right now. So how is the transition? What's it like working for a large tier one that's Chinese owned?
That's a long conversation that typically requires beer. Generally, I would say it's positive. In our situation, the relationship's about a little over 2 years old. They generally let each region do their own thing. So we go after our business, and we're led by Americans. Most of the people on the team are American. We've got a handful of Chinese folks on the team, but in general, there's a lot of autonomy there. An interesting side note that nobody should quote me on because it might get me in trouble. China, this was another conversation we had at lunch. China, in general, doesn't have a lot of global brands. There was mention of GAC opening an office in the US. GAC doesn't sell cars in the US yet. Not because GAC doesn't want to or that they couldn't. The government doesn't want them to, because for those who have been around long enough, you saw the Brilliance vehicle that went through the safety crash test and it folded in half. That was a huge embarrassment for the Chinese government. That won't happen again. They won't have a car in production in the US until they know it'll be okay. So the fact that there's a Chinese-led multinational in Europe and in the US, that's a big deal to China. The Chinese government is very aware of my company, which feels weird to say, because if we fail, it makes them look bad. So we literally have the nation of China cheering for us that we need to be successful. That provides a lot of support. So when you need help and we say, hey, we need some engineers from China get on a plane and they come fly and help, because they are gonna make sure we're successful.
Okay. Jeff, there's been a lot of recent announcements from both Ford and General Motors about sort of restructuring in the business or layoffs that they're offering. We heard a little bit about GM earlier. I'm curious, from your analyst perspective, what are you seeing with these restructurings? What are you hearing? You know, how does this play itself out, and why do you think these are happening now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we completely agree on this. The restructuring is all about getting to that autonomy point. So I think GM sees that. I should say GM's restructuring. Ford's restructuring is probably a little bit different, or maybe a lot different, and should have happened a lot sooner than it's happening. But I think nonetheless, it all adds complexity, and I think a bit of dynamic nature to the current environment. You know, if we're trying to get to that end point, and we have OEMs that are kind of managing that way, it is going to affect, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to affect programs in the near to midterm, and there are going to be some programs that are canceled. So I think it really puts a lot of pressure on the supply base all the way through the tiers to really pay attention to what's happening, not only from the launches that are taking place now, how well they're doing, but how that might impact future launches. And I don't think we're just talking about sedans. We're talking about SUV launches that some of them are in question, some iterations of vehicles that you might have seen fragment further than what we're looking at now from a standpoint will continue to be in question, and I think there's going to be a lot more scrutiny on programs in general. So this next 2, 3, 5 year period is probably going to be quite challenging, I think, in that respect.
Daron, what do you think about a similar question regarding the Asians? I mean, even their stock price has dropped, which is somewhat abnormal for them, right? Honda's doing poorly. Obviously, sedans is part of the mix, but anything about the Asians that you think about that, do they need to restructure as well? Are they looking at things differently?
They're starting to think about it. That's what I say that very specifically because they're only starting to think about it for the most part. It's one of the challenges I think that the Japanese and the Koreans have is that they've made really good cars. They've done a good job of integrating operations over here in this area. But this next transition, which is where Jeff's talking about it, others, the GM and Fords are looking at. They need a different type of expertise to move into this new space if they're going to move into more of this technology type of area. So I think the stock prices are reflecting some of the same things. It's a little bit later maybe than what the U.S. market looks at, which is every one of the car companies is looking at how do we avoid becoming a commodity in the market's view. How do we become more like the technology guys where we're adding value, whether it's data or it's other kind of intellectual property, right? So that's kind of where the value equation is from a market standpoint today. So I think that's where the Asians are suffering a little bit because they have a lot of intellectual property out there. They don't know exactly what to do with it or where to position themselves, in my opinion anyway, at this point in time. Doesn't mean that they won't catch up quickly, but I think they may be the ones that decide they want to be the makers of the cars in the future, right? So that may be the position that they end up taking.
Okay. So we have some folks here that are Michigan government folks that are here that support manufacturing within the state of Michigan. And one of the questions is, what can Michigan and the legislature do to support the future of automotive? And I guess I'm open to whoever wants to take a stab at that, either from a manufacturing analyst perspective.
I can jump in with a real quick suck-up comment. In general, I think they're already doing it. If you look back 5 years ago, what we were doing, maybe it wasn't nothing, but it was dangerously close to nothing. If you look at the work that's going on with Mich Auto and Planet M and all of, Trevor Paul does a fabulous job of driving a conversation, and not just him, but inside the leadership of the MEDC and all the way up to Governor Snyder. I'm not that big of a deal, and it's a huge shock to all of you. But I've had discussions with MEDC where they're saying, okay, we'll bring this to the governor, and I don't talk to governors. That's not what I should be. Michigan is open to doing whatever it takes to drive a mindset of change. And so I think we're doing all the right things. We just have to do more and faster.
I would take it a little further, I think, and this is my perspective. Because in the role we have as consulting, a lot of times we're working with our clients to try and figure out where to put production sites, for example, in the future. I would say that the southern states, if I go to North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee especially, to me, they are much more aggressive than the state of Michigan is, as far as actually trying to reach out, because they've actually scheduled meetings with me in the last 6 months, each of those, just to meet and talk and introduce their team, or they do rotations. So they're just much more aggressive at reaching out and getting a hold of the people to try and market the state. And they're putting a lot of incentives in there too. And so those are the kind of things I think in the state of Michigan, I don't get the feeling that we're as aggressive as they are doing those kinds of things as far as going after those kind of plants. And this is part of why, like in Alabama, eventually won the Toyota Mazda JV down there. And there was quite a fight between North Carolina and Alabama at the end to try and get that done. So I think that's one of the things for the state of Michigan, I'd encourage you to let's figure out a really focused effort to get much more aggressive. I guess, not just say that, hey, we had a great state. You need to go out and really reach out to people.
And if I can bring it together, I would say maybe balance. So, you've got manufacturing, you've got tech. And I think there have been some tech wins and certainly some push on the tech side. So maybe it's finding a balance between those two as we, progress down the road.
So the follow-up question to that was any worries about changes in the administration that are coming in January in Michigan and federal, and at the federal level. Do you think they'll hinder any of these changes that we're talking about for the future of automotive?
For me in the state of Michigan, the conversations I've had, no. That there's relative to the mobility space, there's plenty of other political differences and policy differences, but relative to the conversations that Rick Snyder's been driving in the mobility space, Whitmer's going to continue driving.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the impression I have at the state level. I think the whole fight over the EPA and trying to pull back on some of the requirements around fuel economy and the like, and then GM's rebuttal, and it's kind of the back and forth. We're clearly out of sync from the industry to the federal government kind of view of the world right now. So that's going to have to get consistent because in the meantime, California's going to keep doing what California wants to do. Right?
Mm-hmm. Jeff Schuster, maybe you could take this one. There was a question about sort of infrastructure of EVs, and we talk about Southeast Detroit, we talk about Chicago, New York, but we're sitting here in Albion, Michigan, so the whole concept of EVs here and this, geofencing that you talked about, is the infrastructure going to be here? Will it be ready for when you're predicting EVs to be in the market?
Well, that's one of the big issues and why it, part of why it hasn't been sooner. I didn't talk a lot about. I had some conversations offline, but I didn't talk a lot about some of the risks to volume in the EV space, and even to our forecast. Frankly, infrastructure is a big piece of that. Obviously, the price equilibrium when that happens. We're looking at mid 20s, 2022, 2023-ish for that. Battery obviously is still there from a risk standpoint. Infrastructure is a big piece. You have a lot of different issues going on with that. So it's just actually having charging stations. It's the fact that there isn't a standardized charge from a fast charge standpoint. Everybody's got their own technologies, and it's still from a convenience standpoint. Let's face it, consumers want to be able to charge their vehicle like they fill up their gas. Their gas tank. So until you can get it down to 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes is acceptable, but 5 minutes, that's when you start to see that exponential change in terms of adoption. So we're anticipating some of that coming in, with our, fairly aggressive curve when you look past 2020. So that all plays a role there, but charging stations are a huge element of that.
Yeah, the only addition to that I would say is as you move then beyond ownership into fleet, now suddenly I've got a single owner of a fleet who can then have a centralized charging station rather than the distributed charging station that we anticipate for the next 10, 15 years. And that changes quite a bit as well.
And if they're autonomous vehicles, then you don't have to wait for them anymore.
Exactly.
That's part of where the enablement is really critical in here. I think that the electrical infrastructure is interesting. We've met with a number of the utilities, and it's at the power plant level, they actually, at least we meet with them, there's actually a lot of confidence that we actually have a lot of generation capability already, because all this renewable energy is coming into place, and it's actually supplanting some of the traditional energy, natural gas or coal potentially, or some of the nuclear. It's the last leg is the problem. It's how do you get it from, it's kind of like the last mile in logistics. How do you get it down to your house level, right? So that part's missing at this point, which is what the Jeffs are talking about on the charging station side. And so once we kind of build some of that out, and you have charging stations, as plentiful as gas stations around, then there's a major change in our behavior, because then we don't think about it anymore. It's just going to go plug in somewhere.
Right. Okay. Jeff Stout, I ask you this question as a manufacturer. So there's a question about this sort of new generation of employee. Some may call it millennials. There's whatever the new generation is, but how do you think they will change this automotive marketplace? And will it happen faster than we might have done it when we came out of college? So give your sense from a manufacturer perspective. What are they doing to impact the business?
So we have a fair number of millennials that work with us. I enjoy working with them. Sometimes they're funny. But in general, to some degree or another, it's a little bit funny to me. And then when I came out Gen X, those Gen X guys are apathetic, and it's like, okay, it kind of feels like we're saying the same thing about the millennials. To some degree or another, it's just young people who do things differently, and so then it's just bad. I do think collectively millennials are pretty impatient. Personally, I find that to be refreshing. I don't take it as an affront if somebody who's working for me as a 22-year-old kid after 6 months says, okay, I know everything I can possibly learn from you. I want the next thing. Okay, it's a little bit arrogant, but at the end of the day, he wants next and next. And okay, let's go do that. But I do think there's something rewarding about that relative to this question that says the people that I think are going to be in the plants, whether it's the individual hourly worker or whether it's the line leader or whether it's the tech manager, I think there's going to be a much greater diversity of product and process that we have to manage. And so you don't want to have what we have kind of grown up to accept today of the specialist of I'm the black belt and this person over here is the quality engineer and then this person over here does manufacturing engineering. I think there's going to be, in the future, technical roles. And you're just going to move around to do whatever needs to be done under the umbrella of I have technical skills. And we're not going to have this siloed sense of, well, I only do this slice of the technical things that need to get done. And I think the millennials are particularly well suited to thrive in that environment and not need just a really strong box to play in. They want to play in a big box and do a bunch of different stuff. I think that's what we're going to need.
Daron, I'll ask you this question. The question is, are we looking hard enough at the social aspects, which may actually be far larger than the technical aspects? What if the consumer revolts about being mined?
But being mined like for data, for
Right.
information.
Right.
Well, we probably are not looking hard enough at some of those things as a society even, and there's lots of challenges around who owns the data and who protects you from the data. That's why Europe went through this whole legislative process at the end of May. I forget the acronym for it now. Protecting the individual's data. So it's one of the reasons actually in our model for Europe, for autonomous vehicles, we actually slowed down the growth in there because of the regulatory aspects of who has access to the data is a much bigger deal in Europe than it is here in the U.S. Here in the U.S., probably like you guys, if I put a new app on there, they always ask me the question, right? And I always say accept. I don't read the thing, right? Who in here has read one of those? Right? We have no idea what we're actually giving up, our liberties about, right? So they can look at everything. So we're way too willing to accept that, I think, at this point in time. I think the security issues are going to become a bigger deal. That's going to drive a whole other level of services and capabilities that the millennials actually are really engaged with too. It's a whole different set of issues I think that we face. So the behavior side, I think, on data is one aspect. I think the behavior side, frankly, on how you use the vehicles is another aspect as well. It's back to the point of do you want to share a vehicle or not? If you get in a vehicle with 2 or 3 other people, what if you get in an argument, right? So how do you behave with each other? How's that going to occur? How do you prevent something bad from happening in an environment like that? That's going to be something that challenges us. And how do we take care of things? It's kind of like the latest rage are all these electric scooters, I think, in cities, right? Where you can just pick it up and dump it off, right? And then they have these piles of scooters all over the place. It's driving cities crazy, right? That they've got this mess now. And it's such a cool idea to have, right? So we're not really good at behavior change ourselves. So I think there's a lot of that that's why it's a long runway. It's going to take a while to play out completely. That's why you see in our model too, all the curves, they don't really change dramatically for another 10 years, somewhere in there. But then when it changes and we kind of get some of the rules in place, then I think that's when you see some big changes.
It's interesting you say that we get our phones and we just hit accept and we don't do anything about it. But working in manufacturing consulting, there's this whole concept of Industry 4.0 and connectivity of your plants, your machines, your data. Right. And the companies are like, no way. We're not going to connect my machines to the outside cloud-based world. We wouldn't want them to know. So we're very careful with our equipment, but we'll let anybody know anything we want from our phone, right?
Although just a real quick anecdote, 2 of them on the response to that. Number one, giving up data. There was just a news article about a month ago where Starbucks, I don't think it was corporate global, it was just a region, offered a free cup of coffee if you gave them permission to access all of your data on your phone. And then they published results of how many people said yes to that and how many people said no to that. I don't know what the absolute number was, but the percentage was 100% said, give me the free coffee. $2. For $2, I will give you all my data. What would I do for hundreds of dollars of mobility service? Geez, you can have my leg. I don't care. The other one we think about this a lot. Apologize for the PG-13 nature of this comment. But there's always questions about what are people going to do in the car? Because, back when I was young, we used to, are they going to do that? Is there going to be sex in cars without drivers? And the reality is, yeah, that's going to happen.
Drinking.
But the difference is, connected to the data, the car will know that you're having sex in the car, and they'll know who you are because you called the car. And so the real social challenge will be, what do you do with somebody who acts badly in a car? Can I tell them you're no longer allowed to use my platform anymore? And I take away mobility as an option for someone? Is that a social right that Waymo has, that they can blackball somebody because they do bad things in the car, have a cigarette, something like that? Social questions are fascinating, and we don't know.
Or do you have sex cars and cigarette cars?
Drinking. And
that had never crossed my mind.
Cars and marijuana cars. Now in Michigan, it's marijuana cars. Okay, so last question for each of you. You all, talk to a lot of industry folks, a lot of OEMs, a lot of tier ones. What are you hearing? What are they concerned about? What are the big, large companies concerned about? And what should some of our small manufacturers be thinking about as it relates to their concerns?
I think, back to the point made earlier, I think short term, at least at the OEM and tier 1 levels, they're actually the significant, because right now is launch. just to be really short-term oriented, is that they have all these launches happening, and they don't have enough people or expertise, think of it that way, to make it happen. And so they're really leaning on the suppliers. You guys feel it, I'm sure, out here, right? On the suppliers to help support these launches. And if they don't make them, if they miss their timelines, that's money out of their pocket, right? So that's a huge immediate concern. Going beyond that, next generation is some of the same things we talked about here, is that they're having a tough time figuring out what that vehicle is going to look like. So even though this platform is going to run at the 23 or 24, there's a lot of concern of over-investing into a platform that's obsolete then, in 25 or 26. And so I think you're seeing capital diverting away from internal combustion engine type technologies on the powertrain side, moving to electric. I think VW this morning announced, was it a $50 billion investment, I think, in electric and autonomous vehicles. Nobody knows exactly what that means, but it's a big number they're putting out there. So that's the next big concern, is where's the capital going to go for this next generation? That's what I hear anyway.
Okay. Jeff?
Yeah, I would say for me in the short term, the drum is beating a little bit harder on, what kind of a volume pullback are we going to see over the next couple of years. So it's more top line related, and then how that spills down to the program level. And then the transition that we've been under to the SUV. I think beyond that, it really is kind of building on what Daron said, balancing that midterm horizon, so out through 2025. And if we start to see a more concentrated pullback in programs and launches, which I think is certainly a possibility as we try to balance that investment and capital needs towards the longer term. I think that's a risk in that period, and I think that certainly will ripple through the supply base. So that's something that we're watching very closely. There have been some signals that that's going to continue to be an issue, and then ultimately, it's how do you transition your company to meet the needs in the mobility world of tomorrow? And again, I would still say the return on investment isn't going to be there for a little while. So it's finding those resources and being able to ride it out.
Yeah, I think I would answer it longer than I should, sorry. From an automaker standpoint, the biggest change that I've seen in their behavior has been, if you go back not that long ago, even 2008 changed this a little bit, but not, I would argue, as dramatically as, from my perspective, the last 12 to 24 months. Before 2008, if you went into General Motors and said, hey, I got a great idea for you, this is a better way to make an instrument panel, they would laugh at you, tell you that you're really not that smart, you're just a supplier, and what gives you the right to come here and tell me how to make my parts? After 2008, they were, and I'm picking on GM, it was all automakers, nothing special about GM. After 2008, there was a little bit of humility that said, yeah, we kind of had a rough patch there, but we're getting better, and we'll tell you a little more politely what we want you to go do. In the last 24 months, we have done projects with just about every automaker where they've said, hey, that idea that you showed us, could we pay you to actually develop that, and then we could maybe get it quicker that way? All of our customers that I deal with, this is probably isn't true of the guy who's purchasing who's calling and saying, I just want it cheaper. All of my customers are saying, I need my organization to change faster. How can I get your technology into my car faster? 25 years, I've never had a customer say, how can we go faster? Now I have every single one of my customers paying me to develop technology that they can get into their car faster. Crazy. Step down, what's YF situation then? So shameless plug, we're unveiling a show vehicle in January, 2 weeks after CES, a signature event, where we're going to say, well, this is what we think the future of mobility looks like. I couldn't show any pictures because we haven't released it yet. By all means, that truck, it's going to be on a truck, and so it's mobile. If you work with YF in any way, call Purchasing Scott and say, I want to get inside that truck, and we'll let you inside the truck. We'll show you what our vision of that vehicle is. For sure, there'll be press releases and whatnot, but that is not going to look like a car interior. Historically, for the last several years, even the pictures that I showed are just taking a standard car and saying, well, how can I reconfigure the seats? This is a completely different view on what mobility would look like. Inside of that, the stuff that's in there looks nothing like what it looks like today. So YF has to figure out, how am I going to take all of this capital that I have, hundreds of millions of dollars of capital that I have, and repurpose it to stuff that I don't make today? Am I going to make wooden floors? A little teaser there, we've got a wooden floor. Am I in that business all of a sudden? I think I might be. there is no instrument panel, so the thing that we have up there, are we in that business? What equipment do I need to do that? That flows down then, and the reason I'm bringing it for you guys then, with the lower volumes that we see coming and demonstrating, and I completely agree with Daron on, there's going to be this high volume platform, but then there's going to be boutique top hats that go on top of that. If everything's less than 10,000 units of volume, do I injection mold stuff at 10,000 units of annual volume? Or do I have silicone molds that I do castings at that kind of volume? I don't know the answer to that. And I'm guessing you guys don't know the answer to that, but you're going to want to figure out the answer to that, because if injection molding isn't the answer for these interiors, you want to get on the tracks of whatever the thing is that's going to supply the 10,000 parts a year. And I don't know what that is, so I would love to have that conversation and continue to have that conversation with you guys over years. But those are the disruptions that we're seeing at the automaker, YF, and then what we see as a tier one.
Great. All right.
A big
Thank you, guys.
applause for everybody.
Appreciate it.